Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give the last few people joining a few seconds to join in, and then we'll make a start. So just give us 30 seconds or so. Right, I think, let's see how many people we've got. It's probably most of the people found their way in now, so we can make a start. Thanks everyone that's joined for taking some time out of your day already. We're going to talk through some of the key aspects of a regulatory strategy, which if you can optimize those parts of that regulatory strategy, you can massively reduce your time to certification for your device and your time to going to market. We'll share, first of all, an overall strategy for a regulatory strategy, an overall sort of timeline for a regulatory strategy, but we're not going to get a chance to talk about every single aspect in detail. So instead, we'll focus on some of the typical problem areas, giving you some advice on each one, how you can make that regulatory framework work for you, take advantage of certain features of it. We've got about 40 minutes of talking today from me, and then my colleagues Pete, Shen, and Ronka, and then we'll move to a Q&A session at the end. So any questions, please just drop them in the Q&A section of the webinar chat. If you like a question, you can give it a thumbs up, I think. So let us know that that you're interested in hearing the answer to that one as well. As a company, Mantra Systems, we've worked with hundreds of medical device manufacturers and digital health companies. So we're hoping that you can come away from this webinar with some of the actionable steps that we implement across all of our projects that will help plan out that route to market. At the end of the call, so here's the timeline. I'm hoping you can see the timeline on your screens. At the end of the call, we'll also be offering a handful of freebies as well. So for companies at early stages of device development, we can offer an opportunity to book a free 30-minute regulatory strategy call. And then for those companies that are further through the process, we can offer a free clinical evaluation plan written by one of our teams specifically for your device. But we'll get onto that at the end. I'll start by handing over to Pete, one of my colleagues, to talk through some of the first key steps in a regulatory strategy.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. So I suppose the first thing to think about off the bat is that demonstrating conformity with the medical device regulations of whichever territory that you choose is not an insignificant amount of work. And so it can be tempting to fall into the trap of treating a regulatory strategy as an isolated project because of the amount of work that it entails. But really, a good regulatory strategy isn't just about conforming or complying with the regulations. It's of course about doing that, but it's about doing it in a way that enables you to meet your commercial goals in the most efficient way. And that's efficiency in terms of time and in terms of other resources, obviously cash being one of them. And so that really is a kind of overarching lesson, I suppose, that underpins everything that we're going to be talking about throughout the webinar. So it's worth keeping that in mind. As Simon says, we've got the regulatory roadmap there. We won't touch on everything. I won't start with QMS, for example. But one key thing that we have identified and we often find is that it's really critical that you identify and focus on the clinical need for your device off the bat and early on in your regulatory strategy. And it might seem an obvious thing, however, the analogy that I think I use most often in this area is that we've all been there at a birthday or a Christmas or whatever it might be, and somebody, a family member or friend, has given us a gift that they've put an awful lot of thought into, and they think that it'll be really good for you, really useful for you, but in reality it ends up being opened and left on a shelf, and that's because it doesn't fit into your daily life's needs or your wants in a way that the family member or friend, as well-meaning as they were, intended. And it's a bit similar with medical devices, and particularly in the health tech world. It can be really tempting, as Shen and Simon will touch on later, to focus on developing a really technically brilliant device. But if it doesn't solve a clinical need in a really succinct manner, you're really shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to the commercial traction later on in the project. So the key thing early on in your device development is to be problem focused. Focus on the clinical problem and understanding the clinical problem in a large amount of detail. And that involves understanding the clinical need in the actual current clinical scenario, and understanding the systems that your device will need to be integrated into. So that might be electronic healthcare records or care flow management systems, primary care settings, secondary care settings, for example. Really understanding the clinical problem that your device needs to fix and how it needs to integrate into the systems that it will be integrated into at a later date is absolutely key early on, and that needs to be fed into your design of your device. There's a really proficient way of doing that, and that's through a couple of documents. One is a burden of disease analysis, and secondly, an unmet needs analysis. And both of these are essentially literature reviews that anyone with PubMed or Google Scholar can do if they've got the time and the resource to do so. The burden of disease analysis really is an assessment of the current status quo of whatever condition, for example, your device is used in, or the clinical problem that your device will end up solving. So if your device is intended to help with diagnosis of a particular condition, what's the current status quo of the condition? What's the prevalence? What's the current way of options for diagnosing that condition? What the current management of that condition might be? And then the unmet needs analysis is really identifying the gaps in the current clinical setting. And those are the gaps that your device should be fitting into. So really carrying out that burden of disease analysis and unmet needs analysis early doors, if you can, will enable you to ensure that your device is designed in a way that solves a specific clinical problem and integrates and fits into the systems that healthcare users or patients are currently using. And that's going to ensure that you maximize commercial traction after you've put so much effort, time, and resource into developing your device. So think about that early doors. The second thing to think about early is defining your intended purpose. Your intended purpose is, put simply, one or two sentences that outlines exactly what your device is supposed to do. And there's two reasons really that defining your intended purpose early doors is essential. One is that when it comes to actually meeting the regulatory requirements, you need to demonstrate suitability for that intended purpose. So what you define your intended purpose to be determines the type of evidence, clinical or technical evidence, that you're going to need to demonstrate and find for your own device to support suitability for its intended purpose. And of course, therefore, it determines the type of evidence that you need to go looking for in your state-of-the-art literature review, so that you develop appropriate safety and performance benchmarks that your device needs to meet. But also, your intended purpose will heavily determine the classification of your device. And understanding your device's classification in different under different medical device regulatory frameworks is key to ensuring that you use your regulatory strategy to meet your commercial goals in an efficient manner, as we briefly touched on earlier. And we'll come back to that. So we'll focus really on the EU or European Economic Area and the UK. Those are the areas that we at Mantra Systems have the most expertise in, and that's why we'll focus on them. But really, it's important to note that since the EU MDD transitioned to the MDR in 2017, the CE mark devices have been recognised within the UK, within Great Britain in particular. So with a CE mark, you can sell your device into the UK market as well as into the European Economic Area. And for a number of years now, it's been suggested or hinted at that there might be significant improvements or changes made to the UK MDR that essentially means that the UK will no longer accept CE mark devices. You'll need a UKCA mark to sell into the UK. However, recently that's changed. So it's very clear that CE mark devices are indefinitely going to be accepted in the UK, and with a CE mark, you're going to be able to sell into the European Economic Area and the UK. So you might think, why would anybody choose to obtain a UKCA mark and go down the route of getting access to the UK market for the EU? And that's where classification comes in. It's particularly relevant in the digital health space. So the UK MDR was written in 2002. And as you can imagine, therefore, the classification rules don't really robustly cover software devices or digital health devices. And so there are a number of software devices that will be class 1 devices within the classification rules of the UK MDR, whereas the EU MDR, written in 2017, covers software in a lot more detail. That was one of the key reasons for transition from MDD to MDR, to cover software. And so the vast majority of digital health devices will be considered to be at least a class 2A under the EU MDR. And what that means is immediately you need a notified body to review your submission and give you the stamp that you have demonstrated conformity with the EU MDR and give you your CE mark. And with that notified body review comes a significant delay in terms of time. Really, generally speaking, we hear 12 to 18 months before a notified body will review your technical file for a submission. And of course, this is associated with significant cost. So one thing that digital health developers can do currently, and a tip that we sometimes use, is that if your device is classified based on its intended purpose as a class 1 device in the UK, a sensible approach might be to go down the route of obtaining a UKCA mark first. You still need to, of course, comply with all of the regulatory requirements, but you avoid the time delay and the associated cost of a notified body review. This approach obviously is heavily dependent on your overall commercial goals. So if you have a significant amount of investment to hand and you're not too fussed about timelines and getting on the market immediately, then it might be sensible to still go down the EU MDR approach first, because of course you safeguard your market position across the EU and UK long term. But if you don't have a significant amount of cash ready to invest, or if getting on a market to develop commercial traction in the very near future is key to your overall commercial success, then it might be sensible to go down the UK approach. So really, there's a couple of things early doors that we can think about. Ensuring that you understand clinical problem that your device is going to solve and designing the device accordingly. Ensuring that your device is going to fit into the existing healthcare systems to avoid barriers to commercial traction after you've invested so much time and energy into getting your device to market. Ensuring that you develop your intended purpose appropriately and that you understand what that means in terms of the type of evidence that you're going to need to generate in your regulatory strategy, and what that means for the classification of your device in different territories, and how to use that information based on your own commercial goals to ensure that you choose a route to market that achieves your commercial goals in an efficient manner in terms of time and resource. So those, I would say, would be the key takeaways for myself.
Thanks, Pete. That's a really nice overview of those first few steps in the regulatory strategy. Shen is going to talk us through some of the middle components of that regulatory strategy and how you can make it work for your specific device.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks, Pete. So I'll just expand upon, I guess, what Pete has just said, which is once you've established the intended purpose of your device, which in turn establishes the classification and qualification under each territory respectively, we then move on to the state-of-the-art review. So the SOTA review is essentially the foundation of your clinical evaluation. So it sets out what is currently known and accepted as best practice in the relevant medical field. It defines the benchmark for safety and performance with which your device will be evaluated against. So if you think of it this way, before you can claim that your device is safe and effective, you need to understand what safe and effective means in the current clinical context, and that's what a SOTA review does. So conducting a SOTA review is more than just a box-ticking exercise. It helps you to, as I said, gauge the current landscape for your device and establish benchmarks for safety and performance outcomes that you would use to compare your device against. You can use these outcomes to identify the clinical endpoints that you will use in your clinical studies for your device. And the SOTA review can also highlight risks associated with similar devices in the art, which can then feed into your own risk management file and risk mitigation strategies. So in short, a robust SOTA review anchors the evidence needs and defines the benchmarks for your clinical evaluation, as well as your benefit risk analysis. So once you understand the state of the art, the next step is to generate clinical evidence. We often see manufacturers, especially for software devices, that lean too heavily on equivalence claims, and that focuses very narrowly on technical performance of the device, which can be quite challenging to prove to a regulator. The limitations that we see with equivalence claims is usually that by using an equivalence claim, you are claiming that your device is just the same as a competitor or as a similar device on the market. And that means that you'll end up having to compete on price as opposed to performance of your device against your competitors. Additionally, equivalence is quite tricky for software devices. So under both the EU and the UK regulations, an equivalence claim requires manufacturers to demonstrate similar technical and clinical characteristics of their device to the equivalent device. So this may involve formal agreements that need to be put in place to access the equivalent device's technical specifications, and sometimes for some software as a medical device, even algorithms of equivalent devices, which obviously can often be difficult as no competitor would be willing to share their technical specifications or algorithms with you. So one way that we found as a way of generating clinical evidence would be, and which also avoids costly clinical trials, would be to use post-market follow-up data to support conformity. So as Pete mentioned earlier, I guess using your device to gain market entry into somewhere like the UK, where a software as a medical device would be a class 1, therefore you'd be able to self-certify your device, and the requirement for clinical evidence would be not as high as if it were a class 2A or a class 2B device. So therefore, it might be strategic to gain market entry into the UK first as a class 1 device, and then generate PMCF data once your device is on the market, and use that as clinical evidence to support conformity under the EU MDR, where your device would be a class 2A device. And this might not, not necessarily, it won't necessarily have to just be in the UK. You could use the strategy in, for example, the US, where it could be the 510K, or other territories around the world. So some top tips for generating clinical evidence, it should align with your intended purpose and claims. And it would be useful to use the benchmarks from your SOTA review as to inform what sort of clinical endpoints your clinical studies should look at. And importantly, generating clinical evidence doesn't always need a prospective clinical trial, which can be costly. It is okay to use retrospective analysis and real-world data if it can be justified. So next I'll move on to touching briefly on preclinical testing. I think we find with software developers or software as medical device developers, there is a tendency to focus on technical performance. While it is important to remember that regulators and healthcare systems sometimes look at technical performance. Technical performance alone doesn't demonstrate real-world value. Other things that you should focus on could also be usability, system fit, as well as tangible clinical benefit. So this includes things like how intuitive is a software for clinicians or patients, what is the usability like? Can users navigate it safely and efficiently? How well does your software integrate into existing clinical workflows? Can it easily connect with existing healthcare systems in place? Things like electronic health records, hospital IT systems. So focusing on these broader aspects can also support the healthcare system adoption, for example, adoption in the NHS, which my colleague Simon will expand more on.
Well, thank you, Shen. Yes, Shen just touched briefly there on expanding into or sort of NHS adoption, and that was a question that come up a couple of times in the Q&A part of the registration form, is how can we ensure that our device can meet the requirements of the medical device regulation, but also repurpose that work to support NHS adoption. So it is a really good question. A lot of the requirements for NHS adoption hover around the DTAC requirements and the DCB standards. And to be honest, as long as you're meeting the requirements of the medical device regulation, you're probably doing about 95% of the work that you need to do for DTAC and DCB standards. There are some differences, but a lot of the time it's just different words and different terms for essentially the same activity or the same documentation. So knowing in advance how those two frameworks marry up can be really helpful, because you can write a risk management file that conforms with ISO 14971, which is important for the medical device regulation. But taking that risk management file and repurposing it as a hazard log and so on can mean that you can meet the DCB standards at the same time. So if you can repurpose documents, you can massively save time in terms of your regulatory activities. So that's one really important thing. And then there are other things that you can do to save time as well, and that is thinking about what are the future changes that you'd like to make to your medical device. Software development by nature is a very iterative process, but the medical device regulation almost wants you to stop what you're doing and test that product and put that product on the market. And that can be quite hard, especially for companies that by background are software developers and have strayed into the medical device world for the first time. So yeah, it can be very frustrating. What we normally suggest to our clients in these sorts of situations is have a plan for the changes that you'd like to make in the near future to your medical device, and bake that into the regulatory strategy today, and have it in mind when you're putting together the regulatory documents and performing clinical testing or preclinical testing and clinical testing, and designing your post-market surveillance system. So, for example, when I say structuring your device or structuring your regulatory documents in a specific way, one approach is to avoid overly narrow or descriptive intended purposes. So if we take an example of the intended purpose of a device that is intended to detect lesions in a body part, then don't list a particular lesion or a particular body part in the intended purpose. Instead, keep it vague. So the software is intended to accept MRI examinations as input data, to detect suspicious lesions using a machine learning algorithm, and then output suspect areas with recommendations to a radiologist. So that would be your intended purpose statement. That's fairly vague, but then you can be a little bit more specific with the indications for use. So you would then say that this device is indicated, or the target patient population, or it's indicated for use in adult patients that are undergoing spine MRI, for example. And then what that means is when you're ready to add in a pediatric population to the intended purpose or intended use of your device, you can add an additional indication or expand on the target patient population without having to completely rewrite your intended purpose statement. And that's good because it makes it slightly easier for you, but it makes it much easier for your notified body to accept these changes or just to review them as part of the next surveillance audit, rather than having to substantially rewrite documents. And so making it easier for your notified body makes it ultimately quicker for you, quicker and cheaper to push updates into a live environment. So that's one example of ways that you can try and future-proof the work that you're doing now to make iteration easier over time. Another example might be digital health technologies that are using machine learning. It's very common to want to retrain models, add additional data to improve the performance of the device. And a very reasonable question from the notified body would be, well, if you're changing the data that the device has been trained on, are you changing the device entirely? Do we need to re-review the technical documents that you've prepared, that you've spent a year preparing? Do we need to re-review all of this? And ideally, you'd like the answer to be no, because that adds time and cost. So one thing that you can do whilst you're writing your clinical evaluation, perhaps, is to establish some acceptance criteria. So you say, when changes are made to the device, for example, when retraining the model with additional data, these are the performance criteria that must be met, that demonstrate that the device is continuing to improve in terms of its performance rather than for its performance to worsen. And having those acceptance criteria established in your documents today makes it very easy to go to your notified body and say, these are the updates that we propose to make. We have done the testing. It meets the acceptance criteria that you were happy with in the last round of review. And so therefore we feel that this isn't a substantial change or whatever, and or it is a substantial change, but it doesn't need to be audited today. And so that can, that's just a second example of ways that you can future-proof the work that you're doing today to make life easier for future you, which is always a good thing. But there's other ways of getting it right from the start rather than having to try and retrospectively fix regulatory documents because you've made updates. And so, yeah, talking about post-market surveillance there, that brings us to the end of that regulatory strategy timeline. But I just want to discuss intended purpose again, which you can see on the screen. Pete mentioned intended purpose earlier, Shen touched on it as well, but I think it's really worth repeating that getting your intended purpose correct from the very start is just really important because it feeds into so many of the activities that you'll be doing in terms of regulatory and quality affairs. There's a balancing act to be played when you're crafting and refining your intended purpose and the claims that you want to make. And that's because, as we've discussed, intended purpose has a huge impact on the regulatory success, but also on the commercial success. And there are sort of competing interests there. So a broad intended purpose makes selling your device easy. If you say that your device does everything, everybody will want to buy it, but it makes regulatory approval much more difficult. A very narrow intended purpose makes proving it easy. The regulatory approval will be much easier, but it makes selling your device very difficult because what's the point? And some people fall into the trap of defeaturing their device so much in seeking to be, I just want to be a class 1 device. I'm going to cut out all of the good stuff from my device that nobody then wants to buy your device once it's available on the market. So striking the balance, striking the right balance from the very start means that you can bring a device to market quickly and still have a device left at the end that somebody will want to buy. And that's the thing, it's important to remember that the overarching objective of a regulatory strategy is not just regulatory approval, but it's commercial success as well. So everything that we are doing for regulatory approval, we have to do. So if we're going to do it, we might as well do it in a way that makes selling the device easier at the end. So what can we do that can be repurposed? So I'm hoping very much that overview of regulatory strategy was helpful. We can move on to some questions and answers now. So Ronka, I know that you had some questions that people submitted earlier, but also ones coming through.
Yes. Okay, thank you for P and Shen and Simon's talking. They were helpful. So we got some questions now, and I know we received some very good questions when people register our webinar. So here are the questions. If agreed, you can answer this. The first one is, how can we make sure that we meet NHS requirements while also meeting the MDR requirements? Would you like able to answer?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit, so maybe I'm best placed to answer that one. Yeah, for sure. Most of the NHS requirements are very similar to the MDR requirements. So risk management file was the example I gave. There are some extra parts of NHS requirements. So interoperability with current healthcare systems is very important. The NHS doesn't, it doesn't want to sort of expose its software systems to your products if they're not going to work properly. So device interoperability is very important. But most of the requirements are the same. Cybersecurity is important, is common to both frameworks. Technical performance using device validation and verification is important to both frameworks. And demonstrating some genuine clinical benefit at the end is important. And that's sort of what Shen was talking about is, yes, technical performance is important, but so is coming to the end and the so what. What's the benefit to the patient that results from use of this device? And it's important that you have some clinical evidence to support that. But my biggest piece of advice for meeting NHS requirements for device adoption is have a good understanding at the start of what those are, because most of the work that you do can be repurposed for both NHS adoption and for medical device regulation. So it's not worth having to do everything twice if you can get it right from the start.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Simon. And we got another question is, what are the post-market surveillance requirements for the digital health devices? Okay.
Again, I think I touched on that at the end, but maybe I could go into a little bit more detail. So I guess when I was talking about future device changes, I talked about acceptance criteria for model updates. That's more specific to changes to a device, but that's the sort of information that a notified body would expect you to be collecting. Is you've proved that your device works to get it certified, but how do you know that it continues to perform that well? Perhaps as the device is exposed to different patient populations, or used in different ways that you hadn't envisaged at the start. So there should be some thresholds that you can set from the outset and say, if our complaints rate is less than 1% of the number of active users, or if you've got an ambient scribe, perhaps, maybe you're taking a random sample of consultations and you're looking for the rate of hallucinations or omissions or clinical errors, you should have some thresholds that you can stand up and say, we honestly believe that if the rate of hallucinations is less than 2%, that it should be safe on the market, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't rise above that. And monitoring the performance of the device over time is very important. So I guess the answer there is that your regulatory strategy we've talked about it in terms of bringing your device to market, but there are things that you have to continue to do once your device is on the market. And that's just as important, I guess. It's important to get to market, but it's important to stay on the market as well.
That sounds very helpful. Yeah. And we also get some questions in our Q&A box. So if agreed, you can answer that, P and Shen and Simon. First one is, we mentioned that it may be beneficial to obtain a UKCA mark first for the software as medical device to avoid higher classification in EU. So will the new UK regulations not upgrade the classification of software as medical device to align with the EU MDR? If so, when do you think the transition period to the new UK regulation will be end?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Thank you. I believe it's Michael who's posted that question. You're absolutely right, Michael. So the UK MDR will undergo an upgrade, and the classification rules are likely to be much more aligned with the current EU MDR, and that's currently scheduled for 2026, so fairly soon. So it's fairly likely that most software, medical devices, or digital health devices that are currently Class 1 in the UK will be upgraded to Class 2A. And so really utilising that route depends on how ready you are to go for a technical file submission. So if you're fairly ready to get going with that now, then it might be useful for you if you want to get on the market early doors and develop some commercial traction, utilize the market to generate more post-market clinical follow-up data, like Shen suggested. Then it may be useful to go now and look at a UKCA mark. If that's not the case, then a sensible approach might be, as you're alluding to there, Michael, to sit things out a little while, see the upgraded UK MDR classification rules, reassess where your device falls into. Is it still a Class 1? Has it been upgraded to a Class 2A? And then make a sensible commercial decision from there. So at that point, if you're a Class 2A in the UK and a Class 2A in the EU, you're going to need a notified body to review your technical file submission. Either way, there's going to be a delay and a cost associated with that. So it might be sensible then to go down the EU route and ensure that you've safeguarded market position in the European Economic Area and in the UK long term. So yeah, it's really, again, choosing that route depends on how ready you are for a current submission and how important it is to get on a market for commercial traction and developing and collecting more data in the short term. But yeah, it's a very good question.
And just to put some timelines on that as well, I mean, we don't know any more than sort of anybody else does, but to sort of put it in perspective, when the pre-market amendments were made to the UK MDR, from the date that the amendment was published, it was then a 6-month time frame before that was implemented. So what that means is you get a 6-month heads up that the pre-market amendment was likely to happen. The post-market amendment isn't due to be published until 2026 anyway, and it might be that, I mean, it's a big chunk of work, so it wouldn't surprise me if it was delayed. But also, I think that the UK needs to protect itself from suddenly losing access to lots of software devices that are currently UKCA marked that would be pushed up to 2A devices and therefore would need an approved body or a notified body review. I find it hard to believe that the NHS would allow the MHRA to suddenly sort of create disarray with all of these medical device software manufacturers suddenly having to seek approved body or notified body approval. So I think that, Michael, that is going to change. So I agree with you that that it closes down what some people might see as a loophole, but I don't think it's imminent. So the opportunity is still there for people to take advantage of.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. And we have another question.
Yeah, probably time for one more question and then.
Yes. Okay, so where are we with updates to MDR when considering AI software as part of devices? or purely as an AI to integrate into a organization systems?
If I've understood that correctly, Adrian, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're asking is the difference between AI being used within an organization, perhaps for rota planning or workforce planning, versus AI within a medical device, AI tool integrated into organizational systems. That's my understanding of that question. But correct me if I'm wrong, Adrian, in the chat or in response to your original question. But in that case, if an AI tool is not having some sort of clinical or medical purpose, then it falls outside the scope of the medical device regulation, and you wouldn't need to comply with that. But in Europe, we now have the EU AI Act coming into force at some point in the near future. So that would be important to comply with that. But again, it's a huge piece of legislation that needs regulators to enforce it. And as far as I'm aware, setting up that sort of enforcement framework is still not complete. So I think it's something that's still pending. But when it does come into force, the expectation is that if a medical device also incorporates AI, then you'll need to comply with both the medical device regulation and the EU AI Act. And in those cases, both apply. But you don't need to double things up. So you don't need a quality management system that meets the requirements of the AI Act and the quality management system that meets the requirements of the MDR. They can be one with just some extra add-ons to make sure you cover all components. And likewise, you don't need it to be reviewed by two separate notified bodies. You can have your MDR conformity assessment. It can then have some extra add-ons to ensure that it also meets the requirements of the EU AI Act. So nobody knows for sure the answer to that because it's still a work in progress. But I think the requirements are quite sort of pragmatic in a way, and it can be seen as an add-on to the medical device regulation rather than a completely separate process. So Adrian, I've just seen your comment as well. AI tools that enhance workflows versus clinical decision making. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting as well. So there are some schools of thought where if the AI tool is not making a decision, it's just providing additional information to the user. Sometimes manufacturers try and use that as a way to get out of being a medical device. But it's important to remember that if the AI component of a product is changing in some way the information, which it almost always does, it's an input, something happens, and then an output. If it's being used as part of a clinical workflow, then it probably does qualify as a medical device. It's not always the get out of jail free card that it sounds like by saying we don't make any decisions, the software just provides information, and still often end up being a medical device. But it depends on the specifics, and really the only way to know for sure is to contact a competent authority and take their advice. And that's probably all we've got time for in terms of questions. Ronka, thanks for just bringing those together. So as I mentioned at the start, for people on the call that are early in their device development, we're happy to offer a free 30-minute video call to go over any regulatory strategy specifics to your device or to your company. Just because of time constraints, we can only offer this to 5 companies. And for companies that are further through device development and they've got a medical device that's nearing readiness, we are currently offering a free CEP, clinical evaluation plan, written by one of the team that would be, again, device specific. And again, just both of those things take time. So we'd be happy to offer 5 video calls on regulatory strategy and 5 free clinical evaluation plans for anybody interested. If you would like to know more about either of those, if you let me know in the comments section, I can then reach out to you individually. Or if you didn't want to do that and you felt more comfortable contacting us afterwards, then there'll be an email that goes around after the webinar today. So our contact details will be in there if you're interested in either of those 2 things. They tend to, it's an offer that we've run in the past and they tend to be quite popular. So just let me know if you'd like to take advantage of that. And that, I think, brings us to the end of the webinar. So thanks, Pete, Rongher and Shen. I hope that it was useful for everybody that joined us. And if you have any follow-up questions, then again, our contact details will be in the email that goes out after this. So you're welcome to reach out and ask us any questions that you have. Thanks again, and we'll end it there. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody. Bye.